Good evening, everyone. It is an honor and joy to have Paul Demeda with us here tonight. Paul has empowered people to consciously and holistically manage their health for close to 20 years. Paul is a dedicated individual and practitioner who loves investigating, clarifying, and explaining important nutrition issues and concepts. He is an ardent proponent of critical thinking in the context of health and published research. Paul taught in the core diploma program at the Institute of Holistic Nutrition, where he graduated and taught for over 17 years. Currently, he works full-time between his work as the program facilitator at ISOM, the International Society for Orthomolecular Medicine, and he runs a very busy, private, and successful nutrition one-to-one clinical practice. At ISOM, Paul spent over a year updating the world-renowned Dr. Abraham Hoffer's original book on schizophrenia, now titled Light on Schizophrenia, to support and validate Dr. Hoffer's work. Paul is driven to increase awareness of the foundational role nutrients play in mental health, and he teaches nutrition and mental health and clinical detoxification in the continuing education departments of IHN. Nutrition and Mental Health is running July the 6th to August 17th for 7 Wednesdays from 6:30 to 9:30, and it will be online and live. Let's welcome Paul Demeda.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that nice introduction. Okay, so I guess I can get ready and show my slides, and here we go. So I am happy to be here today to talk about mental health in general, for starters. Just to be able to talk about that is great. But also, I'm happy to talk today about kind of the things that stick with me that I've learned over the years doing mental health, nutrition and mental health. Like I told Elizabeth earlier, when I was in school at IHN, had no interest in mental health whatsoever. Because I didn't think there was much that could be done, slap some 5-HTP, make people feel better. But back then, that was pretty much the limit of it. And then I went to my first ever, it was a medical conference. It's a 2-day thing on mental health. It's actually on anxiety disorders. Actually, it's called the depression pandemic. That's right. And the handout book had probably 200 pages full of diagrams of chemical pathways and all kinds of great stuff, enzymes. And at the end of it, I realized there were things that could be done and that mental health was more than just a thinking problem and an emotional problem. So over the years, I have done tons and tons of research. I've worked with many people who are orthomolecular in the field. I've attended lectures by them. Part of my job, I get to talk to them as well and ask my own questions and learn things from a different level. And plus, hundreds and hundreds of clients with mental health issues. I see commonalities and patterns and of causes, but also what works as well. So one of the reasons I like doing this talk is it helps me to kind of consolidate what I've learned in that past year since I did this talk last year, and kind of present it in a way that is more in line with the way I think about things now and the way I do things. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this, and I'm going to kind of break it down to 5 most important things that you would benefit from considering when you're working with mental health issues. And so we will just get started. So what is mental health? And it kind of goes like this. The reality is it's brain composition, brain structure, brain chemistry. It's part of the immune system. It's the thoughts and emotions and other things, and then a few other things as well. And so it is a lot of things that are not just thoughts and emotions. And so we're going to talk about, actually, I'm just going to go back for a second. Dr. Daniel Amen, who is one of the people who really got me going into mental health and what to do about it. He's got a few YouTube TED Talks, and one of them was called What I Learned from 68,000 Brain Scans. These are SPECT scans where they map out the parts of the brain that are functioning or not functioning, and then do kind of treatments and protocols based on that. And I saw him in 2019 at the Integrative Medicine and Mental Health Conference. And one of the things that he said, and it was absolutely correct, is people don't have mental health problems. They have brain health problems. And so he said, if you get the brain right, then you get the mental part right. So that's the perspective that I follow here. And so the brain is made up of things that are all coming from food. And so here we go, the structure of the brain. I'm not going to go through all the pieces of it, but suffice to say there's different regions and they do different things. And sometimes certain elements or aspects of the brain get larger or smaller depending on, say, stress, for example. And so that's overall structure is important. The structure and composition of the brain cells themselves is very important because what they're made of determines how they work. And we'll talk more about that later. Then there's this whole aspect of wiring. And so you can see in this diagram, we have like flow of neurons. These are the wiring of the neurons, and they all start kind of in the central region and they wire out around the brain. And that wiring is dynamic, it changes. And if you focus on, say, high stress, or you have a high stress situation, you're going to change the wiring to different regions of the brain and you'll get different results. And then the membranes themselves are very important. They provide structure, but they also provide function, not only neurotransmission, but other aspects of brain workings. Neurochemistry is a big issue, of course, and so we have the neurotransmitters, and we have all these kind of messenger molecules and things like that, enzymes, and then, you know, all of these things are components of food. All of these are food and nutrient components, and it's like they have to be. Where else would they come from? So food, very important for the brain. I like showing this diagram because it shows the neurotransmitters and how each of them has certain, we'll say, responsibilities, or they're responsible for things like acetylcholine does memory, attention. You know, I have dopamine that gives meaning, significance, and motivation. And so these are made from nutrients as well. And right, and so they tend to balance each other. There is some overlap so that we have several, say, neurotransmitters working together to give you, say, attention or happiness and things like that. But each of these has roles in the brain and the way you feel and think. And so one of the first talks that really stood out for me on mental health was Dr. James Greenblatt in 2019. That was the first time I got to see him live, and he did something very similar to this slide. And basically, it was kind of like this. The neurotransmission in the brain is binary. And so basically, it's pro-excitatory or it's inhibitory. And there's a regulation there. And so if we look at glutamate, excitatory, and so this side will be excitatory, and this side, GABA, which is inhibitory, they help keep the balance. In fact, about 80% of all neurotransmission in the brain is these two. And what they do is they turn up the volume of neurotransmission or turn down the volume of neurotransmission. And so if we want more calm, we convert glutamate to GABA. Cortisol and serotonin balance each other, and then dopamine, norepinephrine, and then we have arachidonic acid and DHA. And so this is the thing that Dr. Greenblatt said that got me, was these are all largely controlled by nutrients, by the food we eat and the nutrients we get in. And so nutrition, very important. One other aspect of brain function is the way it works. And so this is a diagram of the end of a neurotransmitter. And basically, there are a lot of things going on there. There's neurotransmitters, there's enzymes, there's nerve impulse, all of those things, all of those molecules that make that happen are nutrient-based. And then finally comes the thoughts. And so the thoughts are what happens inside the structure of the physical brain. So I kind of have this saying, you don't have a soul, you are a soul, you have a body. And so that body is, or that soul is expressed through the body, in this case, the brain, and the state that the brain is currently in. So all of that fits together. So we're going to go through the 5 issues, and the number 1 issue that I've chosen today is the digestive tract function, and that ties into a lot of things. And so there are many, many aspects to digestion. If you've ever had a course with me, I can talk for a couple classes on just that. So we're not really going to talk about that. What I'm going to do is point out some key things that help show the relevance of digestion and the importance of it in the context of mental health. So implications of digestive issues, proteins not digested properly. So amino acids are the building block of neurotransmitters and enzymes, so you need your protein. So if we have digestive issues, we don't absorb the amino acids properly, we get decreased breakdown of gluten and casein. We'll talk about those later, but they give us problematic molecules. And we get increased production of neurotoxins. So in the gut, we generate things that are poisonous to brain cells when we have digestive issues. We get more bacterial toxins, inflammatory compounds, and immune reactions. And so whatever happens in the gut travels to the brain. There's a saying we have that leaky gut equals leaky brain. And so all the stuff that leaks out of the gut gets into the brain and causes problems there. Look at gluten and dairy. And so gluten and attention and focus. So gluten shows up a lot in ADHD and actually anxiety and depression as well. But celiac disease, so the inability to digest gluten or process the last stage of gluten digestion, is common with ADHD. And so how do we know that? Studies show that if you put people on elimination diet, this one was children, and you put them on the diet, then 64% of the children of this study had positive results from removing it. And then putting it back in caused relapse. So that's a good way to show causation. Something called exorphins. And so exorphins are these molecules that come from gluten and casein. So gluten is the grain side and casein is the dairy side. And so when we break down wheat and dairy, we end up with gluten and casein. We have these pancreatic enzymes that chop them up into smaller molecules called gliadorphin and casomorphin. There's a enzyme called DPP4, which breaks down those molecules into dipeptides, so 2 amino acids. And if we do that, then everything is fine. That is proper digestion. But some people with digestive tract issues can't make the DPP4, which is made inside the microvilli cells. And so they don't break down the dipeptides. And then what happens is the gliadorphin and the casomorphin activate opioid receptors in the brain. Now, for most people, 95% of people, activating opiate receptors in the brain is kind of pleasant. It's calming. And so this might actually be one of the reasons for grain and wheat addiction. But the other side, the 5%, it is basically it's damaging, it can promote anxiety and other mental health issues. So that's a common problem. By the way, that also ties to non-gluten sensitivity. So people are sensitive, but it's not strictly celiac. So that was brief, but kind of gives you an idea that there are solid factors that are tied to the digestive tract and mental health issues. So issue number two, we're going to talk about diet and nutrients. It's kind of broad. There's a lot there. Nutrients are needed for the structure of the brain, the neurochemistry, and then the energy that's required to run those cells and all the little organelles and all the aspects there. And so nutrients are very important. This is Dr. Amen again. 50% of mental health issues are due to a terrible diet. And if you watch his YouTube videos, you'll see more about what he's talking about. But most standard American diet plus the junk food, terrible for the brain. So here we go. You can improve ADHD just by getting rid of the sugar, the food additives, and common food allergens. So you don't have to do a lot. You don't have to be an expert. A lot of this stuff it might be a little invasive or hard to do, but it does not cause problems. It only gives you better results. And so you can implement these things and see how they go and then take them out. You don't have to worry about doing any harm. So what's the perfect brain diet? This comes from Kenneth Charlin at the Integrative Medicine and Mental Health Conference. And so perfect brain, nutrient-dense foods. So you want to get all the essential vitamins, minerals, and amino acids. You want your diet to be anti-inflammatory. So the mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. We want to keep that 6:3 ratio, omega 6:3 ratio low. So not too much 6. And keep that balanced. Low carbohydrate and moderate protein. And want lots of antioxidants because they're going to protect the fatty acids in the brain and the enzymes. Methylation support, I'm going to talk just a little bit about it. It's a massive topic, still being researched. But methylation requires the folate, the B12, B6. And so there's support for that from the foods. And we always want to consider detoxification. I'm not really going to talk about detoxification today. It's a huge topic. It's kind of weird. I consider mental health and detoxification kind of to be the same topic. But it's important to remove toxins out of the brain. And so cruciferous vegetables, garlic, parsley, other greens, we need the antioxidants. We need actually amino acids and protein. So a lot of nutrients to do detoxification. We want the diet to be plant-based for the most part, but omnivorous, so animals, plants together, and so that way we get a broad spectrum of certain molecules that are beneficial and some vitamins and minerals. Fiber-rich supports the microbiome, and so you're going to get from the plants. Sometimes we can supplement with things like ground flaxseed, apple pectin, and that kind of stuff. And this one I found interesting. I consume all of that stuff mindfully and in the company of others. Why? Because when you're mindful, you come out of fight or flight, and the company of others assumes pleasant company, so that you are not in fight or flight mode. So there are a lot of different diets. I'm going to just pull out the one for autism because it gives you an example of all the types of diets that have been and can be used for mental health issues, not just autism. Some of them won't apply to certain things like, say, depression. Maybe some won't apply, or anxiety or bipolar, but this gives you a good spectrum across the board. And so the big ones to start with: gluten-free, casein-free, paleo, or ketogenic, or Mediterranean diet. Should have put that in. It kind of goes without thinking. Allergy-free, and then you get kind of more and more restrictive as you go down. And then these ones are pretty much specific to autism, but they do have some rules in schizophrenia, and anybody could actually have this, amine, low amine, or let's leave that one out, a high histamine. So it's across the board. So this is kind of just a spectrum of all the diets that are usable. Specific nutrients, I'm a big believer in orthomolecular medicine, a proponent of it. And orthomolecular medicine is kind of based on, if I grew out of vitamin B3 as a niacin and vitamin C. So we're going to start with the niacin. I could go on for hours, but I'm going to keep it short. Just to give you some ideas, what does vitamin B3 do? Helps correct subclinical pellagra, which is vitamin B3 deficiency. And one of the symptoms of pellagra is mental health issues, especially very similar to schizophrenia. It's good for serotonin. Basically what happens is tryptophan gets made into NAD, so the cofactor for vitamin B3. And so if you supply B3, less of your tryptophan gets converted and more is available for serotonin. Improves the lactate to pyruvate ratio, which is a high ratio, is one of the drivers of anxiety. And interestingly, vitamin B3 sedative and benzodiazepine effects. So, and I have seen that in clients, and I do roughly around 200 milligrams of niacin every day now. Been doing it for at least a year or so, and yes, it helps overall calming, and calm state is a good state. And then it increases the effectiveness of things that people might be on with mental health issues. B6 is one I always talk about whenever I'm working with mental health things, because it's required for conversion of tryptophan to serotonin, and that process, tyrosine to dopamine, and glutamate into GABA. So it's required for like the 3 most important conversions in the brain. And so it's also tied to reducing homocysteine, which is toxic to the brain. And how do you identify B6 deficiency? Not dreaming, not being able to remember dreams, or disturbing dreams or nightmares. I remember when I was researching the Dr. Hoffer schizophrenia book, and one of the lines in there is, I give them B6 until they remember their dreams. So that is a marker that I use. Folate's another one. It's tied to the methylation cycle. And so it's required for making neurotransmitters, amino acid metabolism, so using them, but building them as well. Myelination of neurons, so that protective coating around the neuron axon, needed for DNA, gene expression, cell division, and addressing that homocysteine. So folate and B12 go hand in hand. B12 deficiency shows up, apathy, depression, irritability, anxiety. How often do you think somebody going to a psychiatrist with those, will the psychiatrist ask, let's check your B12? Doesn't happen very often. Prolonged B12 deficiency causes permanent nervous system damage. So the roles of B12 are pretty much the same as folate. So those two go hand in hand and work synergistically. Things that happen when with B12 deficiency, you can see agitation, restless irritability, dementia. I'm just going to go through some of the key one, negativism. Who would really expect that from B12 deficiency? Panic or phobias, personality changes, and then psychosis with extreme deficiency. And then there's lots of research, lots of published studies, and basically this one shows that folate and B12 have essential roles in addressing and preventing mood, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and brain aging. Vitamin C. So roles vitamin C, serotonin and dopamine regulation, like I just mentioned, keeps the blood vessels and nerve cell integrity. So keeps them, keeps the continuity of them. Protects the fats in the brain by being an antioxidant, has anti-inflammatory properties, and inflammation is a big driver of mental health problems, and protects from overstimulation of glutamate. So glutamate can come from foods, but it's also generated in the body. And so mental health symptoms of vitamin C deficiency, so decreased focus, concentration, cognitive impairment, anxiety, depression, nervousness, and then steps on the way to Parkinson's. It's interesting to note vitamin C is depleted by stress, and everybody is under stress from what I can see. So research has shown vitamin C reduces psychological stress, and that's one of the reasons it's a no-brainer when it comes to health issues, helps with decreasing blood pressure and lowering cortisol. So HPA axis activation is a problem with mental health, or it's a driver of mental health issues. And low vitamin C tied to depression. And there we go with that. Vitamin D. So vitamin D is tied to serotonin, dopamine, neurons function, brain cell protection, and then calcium regulation in a good way in the brain. And so that's the good news. The bad news is if you live above this line, you can only make vitamin D from the sun between mid-May and mid-September. So now we're good. The rest of the year, can't do it, and you have to supplement or eat foods that are high in vitamin D. And so this is a study that showed that 94% of the people that were randomly selected were inadequate or deficient. So, Dr. Alex Vasquez, who's genius when it comes to nutrition and nutrition science, said that what's this inadequacy thing? You're either sufficient or deficient. And so whenever you get your vitamin D blood test, it's either sufficient or it's not. And so, he said the inadequacy implies, well, maybe you don't have to do anything about it. You must do something about vitamin D. And so vitamin D is a predictor of depression. So vitamin D deficiency shows up in lots and lots of studies. This one was in nutrients. Magnesium is another one. And so magnesium, vitamin C, magnesium are my two favorite nutrients across the board, but in the brain, it's anti-inflammatory in the brain, directly anti-inflammatory. It calms the brain by turning down the volume of neurotransmission by modifying glutamate to GABA. And it's required to make serotonin and dopamine, so feel good, have the focus. And it regulates cortisol levels, so helps with stress management in the HPA axis, and increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor. BDNF is commonly called miracle grow for the brain. And what it does is it helps with protection of the brain, protection of neurons, increased branching of neurons, and increased function. So it's like this magic thing that everybody wants for their brain. And so magnesium deficiency shows up as poor memory, concentration, depression, apathy. I wonder if all teenagers are magnesium deficient. Anxiety, nervousness. When people come to me with anxiety, right away, magnesium. ADHD ties up to autism. Magnesium is depleted by stress. Calcium is not. So calcium increases stress response. Magnesium is flushed out by stress. And so magnesium is the important one to get back in. And remember, magnesium keeps calcium in solution, and so keeps it from dropping into places it shouldn't. And so magnesium in the research shows that it's tied to migraines, depression, and chronic pain, anxiety, and even stroke. So zinc is the other one that's really important for mental health. And so maintains the protein structure in the brain, neurotransmitter activity is tied to all aspects of neurotransmission, and enzyme activity in the GI tract, which is important for digestion and then mental health, but also enzyme activity in the brain. And so zinc in mental health increases serotonin uptake in the brain cells, has antidepressant effects, and when it's low, it's tied to major depression. And so here's a study that just basically shows it's quite common among psychogeriatric patients, so old age people. And so this is the thing, people with old age have typically poor nutrition, poor diets, and then they get the brain issues because they're not getting it. One of the best sources of zinc is red meat, and a lot of seniors do not either eat it or don't have access to it. Lipids, so fats and lipids, or fats and cholesterol, are very important for the brain. The brain's 60% fat by dry weight. And the composition, the fatty acid composition of the brain is, we got a good chunk, about a third saturated. We have a third of a monounsaturated, and then we have the polyunsaturated, which we have slightly more omega-6 than omega-3. And so that is the natural composition. This is based on elk because wild elk eat a natural diet, and so it's not influenced by the eating those foods that are omega-6 or 3 or taking supplements. More studies on the elk, they basically homogenize the brain tissue, and here's the ratio, so we can see the percent of the weight there. And finally, the two most important fatty acids in the brain, or the two most dominant ones, are DHA. We'll start here. Arachidonic acid, which is required for the nerve impulse, and DHA, which is required to, we'll say, put out the fire of the nerve impulse. Those two balance each other out. So we need both. So when you say, or when you hear, you got to keep this omega-6 down, that is true, but not completely down. And so the fatty acids build that brain cell structure. They build this is the bilipid layer. There's the phospholipids with the fatty acid, the bilipid layer, which then holds all the components of the brain. And so the composition of these fatty acids influences the behavior of the rest of the components of the brain, the cell membrane. All right. So essential fatty acids, the structure of the brain, that nerve impulse is dependent on it. They regulate inflammation outside the brain and inside the brain, and every single aspect of neurotransmission is dependent on EFAs. And so some studies show omega-3 supplementation can reduce anxiety. And so in this study, the participants 14% interleukin-6, which is a pro-inflammatory molecule, via LPS, which is lipopolysaccharide. It's a metabolite of bacteria in the gut. And so omega-3 decreases symptoms of anxiety. And so also improved depression. Just put this in so you see the dosing. This is between 6 and 12 years old, 400 milligrams of EPA and 200 milligrams of DHA. That's a low amount, but it was effective in the study. And this one's kind of interesting and shocking. Low DHA and high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio predicted suicide. And so that structure of the brain membrane is very important and influences the way the person thinks and the way things happen kind of behind the scenes, the non-overt thinking stuff. Just a little, this is from Dr. Greenblatt with anorexia, 1 gram of EPA a day for 3 months. So that's 1 gram of just the EPA component. 43% of the patients recovered completely from anorexia, and 57% showed improvement. This is interesting because mainstream medicine really has no answers other than meds, and the meds are terribly ineffective. And so with the EPA showed weight gain, which is good, and reversal of growth retardation, improvements in mood. So fish oils, EPA, DHA, and ADHD. Supplementation with high dose EPA and DHA significantly improved behavior over 6 weeks with ADHD. And here's the interesting dosing. So 6.2 grams of omega-3, 16.2. So 10 grams, 10.8 grams of just EPA, and then 5.4 grams of just the DHA. This is way higher than normal dosing for, say, inflammation, except for some context. But it is the dose that was used to turn things around. Let's talk about cholesterol. Cholesterol is required for function of serotonin 1A receptors. Those are the ones that give us the positive mood. Activates oxytocin, which is the pair bonding, so connection to others outside of ourselves. And so when you think of mental health issues, that kind of shows up in a lot of contexts. You need it for vitamin D production, and for bile production so that we can absorb our fats and fat-soluble vitamins. And cholesterol is required to make the steroid hormones, which have many roles in the brain. What happens if you're low cholesterol? You get reduced serotonin activity or serotonin signal. You get less G protein signaling, which basically translates signals from outside the cell into the inside, and impairs downstream signaling of serotonin. So basically the flow of serotonin signal throughout the brain. Interestingly, monkeys that are low cholesterol diet, aggressive and less affiliative, so less sociable, and can't do that with humans, that kind of study. Low cholesterol tied to ADHD or impulsivity and mood, and oxytocin. This one's kind of shocking, especially when you have mechanism, which we do. Oxytocin receptors are almost inactive without cholesterol because they are denatured at room temperature if you don't have cholesterol. So oxytocin, that pair bonding thing, needs cholesterol. And then cholesterol and cocaine addicts. So people who had low cholesterol values had higher relapses at 3, 6, and 12 months in this study. And so cholesterol plays a role in addiction or prevention of addiction. We got tryptophan here as an amino acid, and this is the important part. Tryptophan is the lowest amino acid in a normal diet, either animal-based or vegetarian. So it is one of the ones that can be hard to get. And how do we process that tryptophan into useful stuff? We get it from the diet, pull out the tryptophan and the GI tract, gets converted to 5-HTP, which then gets converted to serotonin, gives us the calm and blissful, and then that gets converted to melatonin, which does the circadian rhythm. It's antioxidant, it's got a whole bunch of other properties. And here's the key thing: we need nutrients to do that. So you need vitamin C and D to do this conversion, you need B6 and magnesium to do this one, and you need SAMe, a methylation cycle metabolite, to do the melatonin. Tryptophan, we want it to convert to serotonin. If we're deficient in B3, it gets made into B3, we'll say. If we have ongoing stress, it gets converted into vitamin B5, or the cofactor. And with dysbiosis, tryptophan actually gets generated into toxins. And if we have ongoing infections and inflammation, tryptophan gets converted to quinolinic acid, which is a neurotoxin. So tryptophan may be available, but there are other reasons why it could be deficient. Tyrosine is the next one. So how do we process it? We get the dietary protein, pull out the tyrosine, gets converted to L-DOPA, which then gets converted to dopamine, which gives motivation, meaning, promotes happiness, gets converted to norepinephrine, gets attention, alertness, and then epinephrine, which is kind of pay very much attention or fight or flight response. And then once again, we have nutrients required for each aspect of these conversions. We'll talk about nutrient formulas. And this one is a study that was done by Routledge, and it's actually using a nutrient called Empower Plus. And Empower Plus is basically a multivitamin that does not look impressive just by looking at the label. But what makes it special is it's the right forms of the nutrients, so the forms that the brain uses, in the right proportions. And and it is at much, much, much higher doses than you would get in a typical multi. But it has shown benefit with bipolar. I use it with virtually every protracted chronic mental health issue, at least for a while. It kind of helps rebuild the natural balance in the brain for nutrients. And so here's a study looking at this Empower Plus with ADHD. It was 8-week open label, so it means everybody knew what they were taking. And so here is the results when the person was on Empower Plus or the multi-nutrient formula. Their symptoms went down, and when they stopped, they went back up. And interestingly, in the study, there's a gap, and the gap went like this. Where you have these people with ADHD or these kids, and their parents are going, well, it looks like it worked really good, but it couldn't have been that. It must have been something else. So they stop it. And then the symptoms come back up again with a vengeance. And then they go back an hour plus and they start to go back down. Right. So case report with bipolar disorder and Empower Plus. So it's a multi-nutrient, 12 years old. This kid had no life after 6 years old. So basically full on bipolar, 6 years of conventional treatment and nothing, just actually got worse. And by the way, if I recall correctly, something like $40,000 spent on conventional treatments, naturopaths, testing, and no better. And then along comes Empower Plus. 19 days, virtually everything went away. And this is astounding. And so virtually all the psychotic symptoms resolved, functioning, sociability, sleep got better, cognition got better. It's quite remarkable. Empower Plus is also used in traumatic brain injury. Well, it's not used by medicine, mainstream for sure. I have used it or recommended it several times now with people who have been in severe accidents, traumatic brain injury, and about to be pulled off life support. And I won't tell you how they got the Empower Plus in, but they did. And within days, come back to consciousness, and within weeks and months, very, very quickly turn things around. And that's one of the things with traumatic brain injury is, the physical structure of the brain is damaged, and mainstream medicine doesn't put anything in that would help fix that. It doesn't do anything to replace the damage or repair the damage or prevent further damage. So, okay. I got to tell a story about Empower Plus. This is a drawing by my son. Right now, he is like unbelievably good because he takes Empower Plus. That's one of the things. Way back when, he would draw like this. And so he loved cars, he loved drawing. And so he would find a picture of a car and he would recreate it. And so he would draw it as closely as he could to what he saw. And so one day I asked him, what is this thing? And he goes, shows me the picture, and the car was, the sun was behind the car. And so the light from the sun kind of obliterated that. So it was white, so he didn't draw it. So he literally copied what he saw. I was at a trade show, and there was a booth by the Empower Plus people. And so I got a free bottle. And so I gave it to my son to try. And I think he just did 2 a day. And after 3 days, he draws this. And it was astounding. I'd never seen him draw anything like that before. And so this is completely from the creativity side of his brain. And so what he did is he read a book on Alcatraz, and all the criminals are in there. And so what he did was he incorporated all the pieces from the story, like somebody stole a jewel, somebody kept time with a watch, something with the eye, I forget all the pieces. But it was quite astounding to see him go from just copying to full creativity just by getting the nutrients levels across the board up in the right amounts. And of course, what did I do? Took them away and then repeated the experiment. And so he went drawing verbatim again and then back into creativity. B complex or vitamins are really important as well. And so I'm just going to do 2 quotes. You can do a trial of B complex. It can't hurt anybody. You can only make things better. And so that's what was recommended in this book by Rachel. And then this is Dr. Alan Gaby. In my experience, supplementation with a high potency B complex improves chronic anxiety when there is no clinical evidence of B vitamin deficiency. And it's not just in anxieties and depression and schizophrenia and all those. And then lastly, in this section, to quote Dr. Holford, you can't just psychoanalyze away deficiencies in essential fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, and other key nutrients. You have to have them. And this is one thing I have seen over and over again. people who are in psychotherapy and getting nowhere for years. And then we build that physical machine that houses the thoughts and the thought patterns and the emotions. And we fix that up, and suddenly psychotherapy works better. So the next ones aren't as long, but here we go. So issue number 3, where am I for time? Oh, it's going to be tight, but we'll do it. So sleep is very important. These first 3, so the digestive tract, the nutrients, and the sleep, if you don't get those right, there is virtually no chance the person will come out of chronic mental health issues or even short-term ones. So I put these 3 first. These are the ones that make the biggest impact. I don't know if you ever gone 72 hours without sleep. I did once or twice. And I can tell you, it is crazy seeing trails of hands and affected cognitive function. And so I have had clients who haven't slept more than an hour or 2 in months. And like, it's no wonder they're psychotic. So less than 6 hours of sleep increases the risk of anxiety, panic attacks, depression, car accidents, marital trouble, and then obesity. So there are definite risks for not having sleep. What makes it more likely you're not going to get good sleep? Having gadgets in bed. This is from Dr. Amen. So the phones, the TVs, the iPads, all those kind of things. Easy access to sleeping pills, so just knocking yourself out. Doom and gloom news before bed. I was shocked at how many people do that, and then they can't sleep. Other things, stimulants like caffeine and nicotine problems. Big one is lack of darkness. So you need the darkness to make melatonin, and you need virtually complete darkness. And then magnesium deficiency. Sleep actually requires pretty much the same amount of nutrients as normal waking function. And so sometimes people can't sleep just because they're nutrient deficient. So there are lots of things to do for sleep, but key ones are melatonin, which regulates circadian rhythm, but it's also anti-inflammatory in the brain. Also, it's antioxidant properties. It's not habit forming. Dr. Vasquez, I follow his newsletters, and he's talking about melatonin largely because it looks like mainstream medicine wants to take it away. And why? Because it's too good. And so he's writing and pulling the evidence together for melatonin. The dosing that is used in research is between 2 and 200 milligrams a day. And so, my dosing is 6 to 9 grams every day because of this anti-inflammatory, antioxidant properties. L-theanine, there's a few things like that, molecules that change the alpha waves. So basically you need to get into alpha state to initiate sleep. So you could use molecules like that. And then 5-HTP or tryptophan as the precursor to melatonin, but it also has the beneficial effect of being serotonin before it becomes melatonin. So issue number 4 is the confounders. And I kind of talk about confounders. These are things that mess up the way things are supposed to work. And so there's a lot of them when it comes to mental health. And if you don't really understand them or have the idea of the scope of them, it becomes a real issue. And if you do understand these, you can start to see the connections between things and the cause and effect across many confounders. And so here's the key ones. There's the environmental, the toxic medicals, the chemicals, and the yeast, molds, infections, and medications. There's a whole slew of metabolic ones, so changes of function inside the body that are not beneficial. And so the key ones that come up almost all the time, inflammation, brain inflammation is a driver of anxiety, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, just name it. Inflammation almost always is there. Oxidative stress and inflammation go hand in hand. One causes the other, and then it's a cycle. Blood sugar is quite common, so crashing the blood sugar or just having too much. Food allergies cause effects in the brain. And I'm not going to tell the long story about it. If you take my mental health course, you'll get the long story about food allergies. It's quite shocking, but good, but really cool. I love cool stories. Methylation, homocysteine, elevated imbalances of neurotransmitters. The hypothesis there: too much serotonin or too little serotonin, too much glutamate, too much dopamine sometimes, and it goes on and on. Let's talk about a few of these. This is from Dr. Pizzorno. Sources of toxins, 60% of it comes from our food, 10% comes from our water, 10% comes from the things we bring in our house or put on our yards, 10% health and beauty aids, and then 5% comes from the air. And so that's important to know. Effects of toxins tied to ADHD, autism, ALS, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. And so basically, what do we get from toxins? Those research to show cognitive decline, dementia, headaches, IQ loss, mood, and then motor neurons. So the ability to walk smoothly, for example. And there's lots of ways that toxins cause damage, but they can directly destroy neurons. They can generate oxidative stress, which then damages inappropriate microglial activation, so it hyperactivates the immune system, then causes damage and damages the mitochondria, which is important for the energy. And as the energy goes down, function goes down, depletes methyl groups so that we can't do the methylation properly, and then decreases production of this all-important BDNF. The good news is 3 days of eating only organic food drops toxin levels. This is persistent organic pollutants. So here was the conventional nutrients, and then after 3 days of organic, it dropped significantly. Yeast, molds, and infections. This one is quite interesting, and I'm going to use it, two things as an example of how they can play into mental health. This is the pathways for dopamine. So dopamine comes in as L-DOPA. Starts somewhere up here, but here we get the L-DOPA. Dopamine, this is the important part, gets converted by dopamine beta hydroxylase into norepinephrine, which then gets into epinephrine or detoxified, metabolized down. When we have toxic metabolites from Clostridia and a few other bad guys, we can block this enzyme here and here, or these enzymes here and here, and we can back up the dopamine. And high amounts of dopamine are very bad for mental function, and they're tied to anxiety, schizophrenia, a few other conditions. Lyme disease, other parasites in the body. This comes from a lecture by Saruchi Chandra. This was at the Integrative Medicine Conference. And so she's talking about Lyme and other parasitic infections, talked a lot about how they show up in the brain, which is pretty much everywhere. Any type of manifestation of neuropsychiatric illness. Talked about diagnosis and treatments. And but here's the things: these Lyme and parasites can be tied to all of these things, like psychosis and OCD, and we just pull a few big ones: fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, autism type things. And so how often would people like that, or with those kind of conditions, be referred to look at Lyme disease and other parasites? Not very often. This was an astounding story that she told. It was a patient of hers that came in, had already done $400,000 US in medical workups, was in a psych ward for 6 weeks just before he came to see her, and all the symptoms resolved with antibiotics. Can you believe that? It was one thing, and nobody looked for it. Never even occurred to them. And then she said one thing, which I was so shocked I didn't actually quote completely, but I paraphrased it. I wrote it down. If you're a psychiatrist or psychologist and someone presents with neuropsychiatric issues and you're not testing for Lyme and other parasites, I consider that malpractice. She was talking to 150 psychotherapists and psychoanalysts and psychologists at the time. Good stuff. Inflammation. So inflammation is tied to a lot of things. So it's one of the main drivers Blood sugar issues, I'm just going to go through these because we're going to talk more about them in the course. And yeah, we'll just leave it at that. Food allergies as well, trigger inflammation in the brain, changes neurotransmitter, triggers low blood sugar. These are the 7 most common food allergens. And so egg, cow's milk, wheat, peanuts, soy, shellfish, and fish. And the methylation thing, I'm just going to show you quite quickly. Methylation is attaching a methyl group to molecules to change what they do. We need to have these nutrients. And so here is how methylation works. And I'm going to, this is the, we'll call it the complicated diagram. Here's a simple one. I'm going to show you all the things that are tied to mental health in this. So we have the 4 interconnected pathways: methylation for neurotransmitter production, homocysteine for making glutathione, also serotonin and dopamine, and then energy production. I've oversimplified this. Basically, what happens if you don't have this, or you have errors in this, or if you have errors in the enzyme, then all of this slows down. It doesn't work as well. And one of the byproducts is we end up with elevated homocysteine, and I'm going to skip that. We'll do it in the course. And so the causes of elevated homocysteine, which is damaging to the brain, is nutrient deficiencies for the most part. And yes. So the last little bit, non-molecular aspects. So I like to talk about orthomolecular. This is the non-molecular side. And so exercise is hugely important, activates the endocannabinoid system, which is good for feeling good. It's considered the best value in medicine, according to this research paper, and it increases BDNF. And so benefits of regular exercise helps insulin, ketosis, which increases BDNF. Lots of roles. I'm just going to leave it at that. Oh, key one, survival in newborn neurons. So when we create new neurons, which we do, they're very delicate. And so exercise helps them stay around. This is from Dr. Amon, and so he talks about stamp out the ants, so automatic negative thoughts. So one of the things I do when I work with clients is I'm always writing down keywords and sentences and phrases that they use, and then we come back to them and I go, do you realize that you're saying this, this, and this? Maybe you just word this one a little differently, or don't say it at all. And so that's a piece that you can do. Habits are another thing. Sometimes mental health is part habit. I've done this always the same way. It makes me feel bad, but that's the way I've always done it, so I'm going to do it. So one of the things I do is I encourage people to develop new habits, and we start incrementally small and get bigger and bigger and bigger. Resting relaxation is the last one on this slide here. Most people do not consciously schedule in times to come from fight or flight and go down to the rest and digest mode. Humans have done that since the beginning of their existence, and that's why we're still here. And now we do that less and less. Very important aspect. Social connection is very important as well. And so this one basically shows that loneliness increases amyloid burden, so beta amyloid, the plaques in the brain tied to Alzheimer's, and reduces, it does that in cognitively normal adults, so people who don't have Alzheimer's yet. And social isolation activates the same area of the brain that's tied to intense physical pain. So this is important to keep in mind. One of the most important things that's outside of nutrients is having a support network for dealing with mental health issues. I'm going to do some quick basic first steps, and then we will wrap it up. So mental health is these things, and all of these are influenced and modified by nutrition and the effects of confounders. So if you are addressing mental health, if you're addressing the thoughts and emotions, you have to be looking at these. So diet for good mental health, basically you need the protein, you need the fats, lots of plant-based foods, probiotic foods are very beneficial. You want to avoid all the typical stuff that the average person eats, and you want to avoid pesticide residues, and definitely avoid anything you're allergic to. can't remember who said this, but it was one of the orthomolecular medicine doctors. If you take out the bad stuff, it almost doesn't matter what you eat. Almost. Supplementation for good mental health, definitely vitamin C, vitamin D, magnesium, zinc, fatty acids, and B complex, and or a multivitamin and multimineral. So there's your basic supplement protocol, and probiotics. So other actions, you want to make sure the person's getting good sleep, exercise, mental decompression, building good relationships, and there we go. And so I have two resources I want to talk about before I go. One of them is the mental health pages at the International Society for Orthomolecular Medicine. This is a year of my life. That was the year before of my life. And so basically, if you go to isom.ca and you click the link on the mental health, you will see these pages come up. And if you click on it, it will give you the definition of what the condition is, what the conventional medicine does with it, also what the standard of care is. Then it will go through the mechanisms and contributing factors from the orthomolecular side, and then it'll talk about orthomolecular interventions, vitamins and minerals, it'll give you dosing, mechanism of action, and it's packed full of good research. The schizophrenia book, if you're interested in schizophrenia at all, then this one basically takes Dr. Hoffer's original book, and we intersperse either evidence that didn't exist at the time or talk about new things that have come up since then. There is a section by Dr. Greenblatt. There's a couple sections by Dr. Greenblatt in there, and there's also sections by Dr. Jonathan Prowski, and the rest of it is me. So there we go. And then lastly, as Elizabeth mentioned, we have the upcoming Nutrition and Mental Health. It starts July 6th, goes for 7 Wednesdays. I think it starts at 7 o'clock and it's online. And so we're going to go through all of this stuff in detail. We're going to look at case studies. We're going to look at mechanisms of actions. We're going to look at protocols. And there you go. And so that is basically it. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm going to hand it back to Q&As.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. Such a in-depth, informative, and spectacular presentation. That was excellent. We've definitely come away with tons of great information. Lots of thank yous coming in.
Excellent. Well,
yep.
Happy to do it.
So does anyone that attended tonight, thank you so much for being with us. Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask Paul? And I see someone here. Okay, we have, what are some good books to read on mental health?
I always get that question. And so it depends on what level you want to learn at. So the Holford book, Patrick Holford, Optimal Nutrition for Mental Health, is a good kind of basic one. It covers everything to a degree. Most of everything I have acquired comes from piecemealing things together. So I don't actually have any books. A good one, the schizophrenia book, The Light on Schizophrenia. Dr. Hoffer said in the original book, if you understand schizophrenia, understand all mental health. So I would agree that would be a good place to start as well.
Fantastic. Yeah. And Carrie Fuller. Hi, Carrie. So nice to have you with us tonight. Carrie is an alumni of IHN. And she says, looks like I might be picking this as a niche. So there you go, Paul. You have inspired and stimulated many beautiful souls out there. So that's great, Carrie. We absolutely applaud you. And it is an incredible niche to focus on, definitely.
And it's a huge niche.
That's right. We have a question. Is trauma considered mental health?
Well, trauma would be, it's a condition that has mental health ramifications. Oh, hold on. I'm thinking brain trauma. Okay, so if we're talking about trauma as in life traumas and things like that, is that mental health? No, it is a cause of mental health conditions, which can then feed back and then keep it going. But trauma is definitely something that's addressable, at least in part, with nutrition. And I've found that people who have trauma who I work with, a lot of that is easier to deal with, and sometimes actually becomes a non-issue after the brain has been normalized. But I will tell you, when it comes to trauma, if you got, okay, I'm thinking brain trauma. I'll do the brain trauma one first. When it comes to brain trauma, as soon as you can, absolutely. And this includes concussions, vitamin C, as much as you can get in, up to 6-7 grams a day, 8 grams, because it prevents what's called hyperreperfusion, which is kind of when the blood supply has been shut off, the slamming into the blood vessels when it's reopened again or reestablished. And there's plenty of evidence that vitamin C is actually very important for that. So right off the bat, do that. For mental emotional trauma, you want to do the calming things. And it's like vitamin C, niacin. And if it's like anxiety and stuff, then you don't want the flush, then you look at niacinamide and then magnesium. So, and then fish oils, absolutely. So remember, trauma has a inflammatory component, and it also lives in certain parts of the brain. And one of the things that I found important, beneficial for that is also N-acetylcysteine, so NAC. Okay.
Fantastic. Okay. And what is the supplement you gave your son?
It's called Empower Plus, and I'm not affiliated with them at all. The only reason I talk about them is, one, because it works, and two is because there is, I think, 40 research papers published on it now. And so you can get it from truehope.com. That's in Canada. And it's interesting because it was created for bipolar to get people off of their meds, which it's very effective at. And they actually have advisors to help people who want to get off their meds with the process. And so if you were to go to buy the stuff and say you wanted to order like a couple bottles, you would get an email going, hey, so why do you want to buy it? What do you want to do? And then you would actually get interviewed. And so they're very responsible about the process. If you work with me, then I do that part. Yeah, so it's called Empower Plus.
Yeah. Very excellent company, high integrity, and incredible support. We've had great experiences with them over the years. And just a great note here from Lindsay Jones. She said she's looking forward to the course. She has so many questions and she will save them for the course.
All right. You got questions. I got answers.
That's right. Okay. If my son is on an antidepressant, is there any type of vitamin that he cannot take?
It depends what the antidepressant is. And for most of the nutrients, they are safe. Now, the issue comes from basically what happens. Let's say somebody's on an antidepressant to increase serotonin. And so typically it is SSRI. So it increases the amount of serotonin in the synapse. So bouncing back and forth between the neurons, giving that signal, it increases that by preventing reuptake, so reabsorption. So it does not increase the amount of serotonin. It does absolutely nothing to generate serotonin, which is the hypothetical reason for being having the condition in the first place. So as you provide the nutrients that start generating serotonin, allowing the body to make it, then you can end up with excess serotonin, because now you're making the serotonin and the drug is keeping it bouncing back and forth in the space. So actually, one thing you cannot take with an SSRI is 5-HTP and maybe tryptophan. Okay, so when I say cannot, I mean you cannot if you don't know what you're doing. If you have experience, then you can cross-taper and to get people off their meds. Now, the other thing is you can find, just by taking away the confounders and providing nutrients, that the need for the med goes down and across the board. So, and then same thing for tyrosine. If you're on SNRI and NSRI, you can't do the tyrosine because the same issue with building up too much dopamine.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Where would you start when someone comes in initially for mental health support with nutrition? I presume it's a very long and patient process. Great question.
It can be a long and patient process. I actually start with that. Actually, since I did the mental health pages, the first step is to send people there. And so what I want them to do is I want them to go to the mental health pages so they can look and get an idea of all the things that could be tied to their mental health issue that are not being dealt with. And so it opens up the realm of possibility. And then we talk, and then I show them kind of what I think we can do and how we would do it. And then we do the first session. But before the first session, they fill out my questionnaire, which has 700 questions. Most of them are symptoms that they just check. And then in the first session, we go through that because it is still a full body thing. The brain is not separate from the body, just like your kneecap's not separate from your body. So I want to capture everything that is going on physically with them as well as mentally. And then we start to get into the mental things. And then it's all about, well, how did this happen? And why do you have this and the other person doesn't have that? And so there's a lot of exploration, I would say. And so sometimes I think the longest ever intake was 3 hours. And but sometimes they're much shorter.
About right.
Yeah. So, but you always have to remember you're considering a body or a person who has a condition, not the condition. So you got to start with the everything.
Yeah. That was a beautifully well-rounded answer, Paul. Could have started anywhere, but that was great. And so Carrie, thank you so much. She said it's been great. Thanks for sharing, and lots of other thank yous from everyone. Another alumni, Brent Lockridge. Hi, Brent. So nice to have you with us as well. And Brent had a question. Are the long-term effects of the SAD reversible? We have at least a couple of generations of folks raised on this diet, and we are seeing the results on a societal level now. What can we do?
Right. I think the saying I learned in fundamentals the first time is you can fix anything as long as you don't cut it out. So yes, the effects of by SAD, I assume you're talking standard American diet, are reversible. The further or the more damage from it or deficiencies, the longer it'll take to come out. But yes, anything's reversible. I have seen stories and seen case studies over the years of people who are in their 80s and turn things around completely with the diet. And so what can you do about years and years of doing this? You start small, incrementally. That is the other thing when you work with people with mental health issues, it is incremental change. You do not want to stir up the pot and stir too many things at once. And you always want to do things in a way that you kind of, I implemented this. What was the result? What did we learn from this? Was it positive, negative? What are we going to do next? So you do it that way. The diets that I do most often, introduce everybody to Mediterranean diet, and then we look at paleo or keto as other options to that, or derivatives of that kind of thing. And we typically start with one meal a day, which is breakfast or the first meal that they happen to be eating. I think that should cover it.
That should cover it. And Shaheen is asking, yes, we will definitely have a recording of tonight's webinar with Paul. So just look out on the weekly digest and this week. So it'll definitely be sent. We look forward to seeing all of you again. And we hope you can be able to take the continuing education course with Paul. It will definitely be worth it. Speaking from personal experience, I've taken the course and it was sensational. You learn so much and you can apply so much to your own life and to the lives of your clients in so many ways. So, Paul, thank you very much for your lecture tonight. And we look forward to seeing you very shortly as well. And thank you to all the beautiful souls tonight that attended our webinar tonight with Paul. And thank you. Have a beautiful evening.